Now let's shift gears and look at what Europe has been up to. Today there was a historic vote. The European Union had gathered to address a tricky problem, tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Now before we get to the story, a quick primer. A tariff is like a tax on imported goods. Companies pay tariffs to do business in foreign countries. It's like a cut that your government takes to allow foreign countries to ply their goods. What this means for you is that the foreign products become more expensive. You see, companies exist to make profits. If they're forced to pay a tariff, they make up the difference by hiking their prices, meaning you, the consumer, have to pay more. Now, with that out of the way, let's turn to Europe's dilemma. A few weeks ago, the EU decided to impose tariffs on Chinese EVs. Why? The official reason is convoluted. Overcapacity, illegal state subsidies, you'll hear these terms and others like these being thrown about. But the real reason is quite simple. Chinese EVs were flooding the European market, undermining local automobile firms because the Chinese cars were cheaper. So Europe made up some excuses and slapped tariffs. The goal is to make Chinese EVs more expensive, in the hope that if the Chinese cars become more costly, Europeans will opt for local products instead. It's basic protectionism. But not all EU members thought this way. There were stark divisions within the bloc. A major dissenter was Germany, Europe's economic engine and traditional automobile hub.
We regret that today there was no majority from the EU member states to stop the decision, although there were a great many no votes and abstentions. And in this context, I very much welcome the fact that the German government at least responded with a clear no. Today's decision may be the beginning of a further escalation in the trade disputes with China. We need to hold critical discussions here, but we do not consider the instrument of introducing tariffs to be appropriate. And the news is also difficult for consumers, because the tariffs will make electric cars more expensive.
Now that may sound odd, that Germany wanted to encourage competition. After all, the tariffs were meant to benefit local companies, but that won't help Germany. Because most German auto companies have factories in China. They make the bulk of their products abroad and then import them. So a lot of German cars in Europe are actually made in China. The automobile factories in Europe are effectively showpieces. The firms make their real money by manufacturing in China and then selling to the rest of the world. So these German brands will also have to pay tariffs for bringing their China-made cars back to Europe. That is why Germany was opposed to the tariffs. Other EU members were also against the measure because they import a lot of things from China and they're afraid of retaliation, which, by the way, has already begun, the retaliation. After the EU first announced the EV tariffs, China started looking into European exports, like pork, dairy and brandy. A classic case of tit for tat. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán summed it up best.
Let us make it clear. What we are doing now, and what they're making us do, what the European Union is doing, is an economic Cold War.
He doesn't want a trade war with China. Neither did Germany, Malta, Slovenia and Slovakia. These countries voted against the tariffs, but it wasn't enough to block them. So the EU will place tariffs on Chinese EV imports. They will range from 8 to 35%, depending on the Chinese company. And you can be sure that China will retaliate unless Europe backs down and reaches some sort of settlement. In fact, negotiations are still on. The EU can still work out a compromise. The deadline is October 30th. But now let's take a step back and think of the bigger picture. Should the EU back down? Yes, the tariffs will spark a trade war. Yes, prices will go up. Yes, protectionism will rise. But so what? Is that really a bad thing in the long run? Europe is where it is today because it is no longer competitive. Why did the German companies make plants in China? Because they could not make competitive cars at home. And what was the result? Job losses, stagnation, and finally utter dependence on Chinese imports. Things are slightly cheaper, sure, but Europe is now dependent on Beijing's good graces. It prays for China's forgiveness and fears tariffs on pork, milk and brandy. Seriously, how the mighty have fallen. Perhaps it's time for Europe and the world to introspect. Yes, globalization can be a good thing. It can make things more affordable for common people. But how far should you go? Should you surrender your sovereignty for pretty Chinese baubles? There needs to be a balance, at least a little bit of protectionism, we say. Local production may lead to higher costs, but it also generates jobs. It provides security from supply chain disruptions, and it gives you some leverage, especially when dealing with bullies like China. The EU has finally shown some spine. Hopefully, they do not capitulate by the end of this month. As for the rest of the world, perhaps it's time we start fine-tuning our own policies to make sure we don't become as fearful as the once mighty Europe.